The sirens outside had been going on for hours. I stood by the window, phone in hand, watching the street below. It looked normal enough, except for the people moving quickly, heads down, some pulling kids by the hand. I looked at the phone again, hesitating for a moment before dialing. Still no answer. I left another voicemail. "Mike, it's me. Call me when you get this, okay?" I hung up and rubbed my hands over my face. Maybe he was stuck in a meeting. Or maybe the phone lines were jammed. There had been a lot of sirens today. I flicked on the TV for some background noise. The news was on, and the anchor was talking fast, her voice climbing a little higher with each sentence.
Authorities are urging residents to remain indoors as emergency services deal with violent incidents spreading across several neighborhoods.
I stared at the screen, my thumb frozen on the remote. They were showing shaky footage from a helicopter. People running, cars piled up in the middle of an intersection, a fire burning in the distance. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Grabbing my jacket and keys, I shoved them into my pockets. I needed to find Mike. He was supposed to be at work, but with everything going on, who knew where he could be now? When I stepped outside, the heat hit me first. It was the kind of summer day where the air sticks to your skin and the pavement feels like it's melting underfoot. But the street was different. There were cars abandoned at odd angles, their doors hanging open, some still running. The city always felt busy, but now it was quiet. Too quiet for this time of day. I kept walking. I didn't know where to start, but standing still wasn't going to help. Maybe I could catch a bus downtown, or better yet, find a cab. But as I walked, the streets felt more and more wrong. There was trash everywhere. Abandoned bags, shoes, broken bottles, and no sign of why people had left in such a rush. I turned a corner and saw a man sitting against the wall of a store, his head slumped forward. I slowed down, debating whether to ask if he was okay, but I didn't. Something about the way he was sitting, it didn't feel right. His clothes were dirty, and there was something about the way his body twitched every few seconds that made me walk faster. I passed more people as I made my way down the street, some walking in a daze, others looking confused and scared. The city felt like it was on the edge of something, but I couldn't tell what. Maybe the news had blown things out of proportion. Maybe this wasn't as bad as it looked. But the sirens hadn't stopped, and I could hear the dull roar of helicopters overhead. I turned down a quieter street, trying to think of where Mike might have gone. If he wasn't at work, maybe he'd tried to get home. It made sense, right? But I hadn't seen any buses, no cabs, nothing that could help me figure out how to get to him. That's when I heard it. A sound like someone choking or coughing coming from the alley to my left. I stopped, turning my head toward the noise. I don't know why I walked closer. Maybe I thought someone needed help, or maybe it was just curiosity. There was a man hunched over, facing away from me, his shoulders shaking with every breath. His clothes were torn, and there was something wrong with his skin. It looked pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen the sun in days. I hesitated, wondering if I should say something. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. No answer. He just kept making that awful, gurgling sound, his whole body jerking with every breath. I took a step back, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. There was blood smeared on his shirt. Fresh, dark. His fingers twitched as he slowly turned his head toward me, and for the first time, I saw his face. His eyes were bloodshot, wide, and his mouth hung open, stained with blood. His lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl. My breath caught in my throat as he took a step toward me, dragging one foot behind him. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I hit the main road again. The air was filled with the sounds of shouting, distant crashes, and more sirens. I wasn't the only one running now. People were everywhere, some pushing past me, others stumbling in confusion. A woman was crying into a payphone, her words lost in the noise. Something had happened. Something bad. I reached for the payphone myself, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no way to call Mike. Panic started to creep up my spine. I needed to get to him. The office wasn't that far, but with every step, the streets felt less familiar, more dangerous. Bodies lay crumpled on the sidewalks, some moving, some not. I tried not to look too closely at the ones that weren't. There was no time to stop. I had to keep moving. I kept running, weaving between the growing crowds and abandoned cars. The smell of smoke filled the air, sharp and acrid, and I could hear shouts from further down the street, people yelling for help or shouting at each other. No one seemed to know what was happening, and the chaos was only getting worse. Mike had to be close. I kept telling myself that. He wouldn't just disappear, not without calling or trying to get home. But with no buses running, no way to reach him, I felt like I was trapped in some nightmare version of the city I thought I knew. The further I went, the worse it got. A man stumbled past me, clutching his arm, blood running between his fingers. His face was pale, eyes wide, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. People like him were everywhere now, bleeding, limping, covered in dirt and blood. Some looked like they were hurt, others like they'd lost all sense of where they were. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the street ahead, but every time I looked up, I saw more. Faces I didn't recognize, all of them blank, lost. It was like the whole city had been turned inside out. Then I saw someone I knew. I almost didn't recognize her at first. Julie, from the cafe down the street. I'd known her for years, seen her almost every morning on my way to work. She was standing at the corner, her back to me, looking as if she was trying to cross the road. I don't know why I thought she could help, but seeing her, someone familiar, felt like a lifeline. "Julie," I called, pushing through the crowd to reach her. "Julie, it's me." She didn't turn around right away, and for a second, I wondered if she'd heard me. I reached out, my hand almost touching her shoulder when she finally turned. The blood drained from my face. Her eyes were glazed over, distant, like she wasn't really there. There was dried blood streaking down from her hairline, and her mouth was open just a little, her lips pale and cracked. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Julie," I whispered, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. She just stood there, staring past me like she didn't even see me. For a moment, I thought she was dead on her feet. Then she took a step forward, her movements slow, almost mechanical. I took another step back, my hand covering my mouth. She wasn't okay. None of them were. I turned and walked away as fast as I could without running, trying to fight the urge to look back. There was no point. Whatever was happening to them, to all of us, was spreading faster than I could keep up with. I cut through an alley, the noise from the street fading behind me. My legs were aching, and my breath was coming in sharp bursts, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. Every part of me was screaming to get out, to find Mike, to get somewhere safe. But the deeper I went into the city, the clearer it became that there was no safety here. Not anymore. I heard the sound of glass breaking up ahead and ducked behind a dumpster, peeking around the corner to see what had caused it. 2 men were smashing the windows of a convenience store, pulling cans and bottles from the shelves. One of them was shouting, something about needing food, needing water. His voice was frantic, like he couldn't believe what was happening. I stayed low, waiting for them to leave before slipping out onto the street again. My hands were shaking, and every shadow felt like a threat. The city I'd grown up in, the city where I'd built a life, was falling apart right in front of me. Mike was supposed to be at work. That's where I needed to go next. But as I crossed another empty street, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A group of people, at least a dozen of them, stumbling through the intersection. They weren't running, weren't even moving with any sense of purpose. They were just walking, their heads down, bodies slouched. And then, one by one, they started to fall. It was like watching dominoes collapse, each one hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Some of them didn't get back up. Others did, dragging themselves across the ground, their limbs moving in ways that weren't right. My stomach turned. Whatever this was, it was spreading, and fast. I quickened my pace, the dread building in my chest. Mike had to be close. I couldn't afford to think about what I'd just seen. He had to be okay. He just had to. As I passed a pharmacy, I heard another sound, this one closer. Footsteps, but slow, uneven. I froze. It was the same sound I'd heard earlier, that slow, dragging walk. My heart raced, and I looked for somewhere to hide, ducking behind a row of parked cars. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I peered around the corner, and that's when I saw him. A man, his face pale and streaked with blood, limping toward me. His clothes were torn, his mouth open in a silent groan, and his eyes, those empty, glazed-over eyes, locked onto me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted, running down the street as fast as I could, my legs screaming in protest. I couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. My lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. Every corner I turned, the city seemed to be crumbling faster. People screaming, pushing past me, some bleeding, others already staggering in that slow, unnerving way. The infected. I'd seen enough of them now to know that's what they were. Whatever this was, it was turning people into something else, something terrifying. I couldn't think too much about it. All I could focus on was Mike. I finally reached the street where his office was. Normally, it would be packed with cars and people, business suits and briefcases, but now it looked like a war zone. Windows were shattered, debris littered the ground, and the few people I saw were running, their faces twisted in panic. Mike had to be here. I pushed forward, my eyes scanning the building ahead. The front doors were smashed open, glass everywhere. I stepped carefully over the shards, moving inside. The lobby was empty, eerily quiet, except for the hum of broken fluorescent lights. "Mike?" My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Nothing. I moved through the lobby, heading for the stairs. The elevators were dead, the buttons unlit. I climbed, each step harder than the last, my breath shallow and ragged. I had no idea if Mike was still here, but there was no turning back now. I reached the floor where Mike's office was. It was quiet, too quiet. The door to his office hung open, and for a second, I almost convinced myself that everything would be okay. That I'd walk in and he'd be sitting at his desk, working like it was just another day. But as I stepped inside, I saw it wasn't like that at all. The room was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, the desk pushed up against the wall like someone had tried to block the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the room. And then I saw it. blood. A dark smear of it on the carpet, leading toward the back of the room. My stomach dropped. I followed the trail, my hands trembling as I reached the small break room in the back. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might find. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his head tilted to one side. Mike. Relief surged through me, and I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside him. Mike, it's me. For a moment he didn't move, and my heart sank. But then he stirred, his head turning slightly toward me. His eyes opened, but they were glazed over, unfocused, like he was struggling to see me. I grabbed his hand. Mike, what happened? Are you hurt? His lips parted, and a low guttural sound escaped him. I froze. That sound. It wasn't right. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes were torn, stained with blood. My hands shook as I touched his shoulder, gently turning him toward me. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then his mouth twisted into a snarl. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. Mike? He moved slowly, his body jerking unnaturally as he tried to get to his feet. His hands clawed at the ground, and I saw it then. The bite. A deep, bloody wound on his arm, the flesh torn and swollen. No, I whispered, backing away. No. He was infected. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But the truth was undeniable. He was one of them. Tears blurred my vision as I stood up, my back hitting the wall. He was still trying to get to his feet, but his movements were slow, uncoordinated, like he was fighting his own body. I should have run. I knew I should have, but I couldn't leave him. Not like this. I reached for him again, my hands shaking, desperate to pull him back, to make him see me, to make him be him again. Mike, please. He looked at me, but it wasn't him. His eyes were empty, his body moving with a jerky, mindless purpose. The man I knew, the man I loved, was gone. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Mike was gone. There was no saving him. All I could do now was survive. I wiped the tears from my face, forcing myself to stand. I backed away slowly, leaving him there in the break room, his groans echoing in the silence. The streets outside were worse than when I'd entered. Whatever was happening was spreading fast. People were running, screaming, being chased by the infected. It felt like the city was falling apart around me, and all I could do was keep moving. I didn't have a plan anymore. My only goal now was to get out. Get out of the city, get away from this nightmare, and figure out what to do next. But as I moved through the chaos, it became clear that there was no easy way out. The roads were blocked with abandoned cars, and the infected were everywhere, wandering aimlessly or attacking anyone who got too close. I ducked down alleyways, cutting through back streets, trying to stay out of sight. My mind was numb. The images of Mike, of his glazed-over eyes, burned into my thoughts. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. I reached the edge of the city as night began to fall. The streets were quieter here, less crowded, but the threat was still there. The infected were moving in packs now, their groans filling the air like some horrible chorus. Up ahead, I saw a barricade, makeshift, with cars piled up and barbed wire strung between them. It looked like someone had tried to stop the spread, but from the looks of it, they hadn't been successful. I could hear the faint sound of a radio crackling in the distance, a news report barely audible over the static.
The virus has spread to neighboring cities. Confirmed cases in multiple states.
I stopped in my tracks, multiple states. The outbreak wasn't just here. It was everywhere. The weight of that realization sank in. There was no escape. Not really. No matter how far I ran, the infection would catch up eventually. And even if it didn't, what kind of world would be left? I stood there for a moment, watching the infected wander through the streets, aimless, relentless. The city behind me was lost. I'd lost Mike. I'd lost everything. And yet, I was still here, still standing. With a deep breath, I turned away from the barricade and started walking, leaving the city behind. Maybe there was a place out there that hadn't been touched by this. Maybe there wasn't. But as long as I was still breathing, I had to try. I kept walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I pushed on, leaving the city's wreckage behind me. The barricade was far in the distance now, just a jagged silhouette in the dimming twilight. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The streets were emptier here, quieter. For the first time all day, I could hear myself breathe. But no matter how far I walked, that radio broadcast echoed in my head. The virus had spread to other cities, other states, maybe even further. There was no stopping it, no outrunning it. All that hope I had of escaping, of finding safety, it was a lie. The virus was everywhere. I came to a stop in the middle of the road. The silence was unsettling, too thick, too final. No sirens, no screams, nothing. I was alone. And yet, in that moment, something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I felt it before I heard it. A soft shuffling noise behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing, ready to see another one of the infected limping toward me. But there was nothing, just the empty street. Then a sound, a footstep, soft but unmistakable. Hello? My voice came out weak, barely more than a whisper, but I regretted it instantly. The silence swallowed the word whole, and I felt my skin crawl. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the empty street, searching for something, anything. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, far enough that I couldn't make out the details, but close enough to see the way they were swaying, their shoulders hunched. My heart stopped. It looked like Mike. I blinked hard, my mind racing. It couldn't be him. I had left him back at the office, hadn't I? He'd been bitten. He'd turned. I'd seen it. But as I took another step forward, the figure took a step too, closing the distance. Mike, I whispered, my throat tightening. The figure stopped moving, standing still, but just watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move.
Mike!
I repeated, louder this time. My hands were shaking, my thoughts spiraling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be him. He was gone. I had left him behind. He couldn't have followed me. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step toward the figure. Is that you? Suddenly, the figure collapsed to the ground, crumpling like a puppet with its strings cut. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. What was I thinking? Of course it wasn't him. I didn't want to move any closer. I should have just turned around, kept walking, but something pulled me forward. I had to see. As I approached, I could see more clearly now. The figure on the ground wasn't Mike. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Just a man, maybe in his 30s, lying face down on the pavement. His clothes were tattered, his body covered in dirt. But it wasn't the way he looked that made me stop cold. It was the bite mark on his arm, the same bite, the same infection, just like Mike. But he wasn't moving, not anymore. I stepped back, my chest tight, a sinking feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. I needed to leave, now. But before I could turn to go, I heard something. A rustling, like paper scraping against the asphalt. It was coming from the man's hand. He was holding something, a folded piece of paper. Without thinking, I reached down, prying the note from his stiff fingers. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The writing was smeared, shaky, but I could still make out the words. It was short, just one sentence. It's in the air. The realization hit me like a hammer to the chest, stealing the breath from my lungs. My heart faltered, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Panic clawed at my throat, and I looked around wildly, desperate for any sign of escape. I looked around, panic rising in my throat. The infected weren't following me. They were ahead of me, waiting. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I saw another figure, then another, emerging from the shadows of the buildings around me, moving slowly but deliberately. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figures around me closed in, their faces blank, but not aggressive. They weren't going to chase me. They didn't need to. My head had been pounding since earlier, but now it felt like my thoughts were slipping, fading. I touched my face, feeling the slick sweat on my skin, the heat rising in my body, the fever. It had started hours ago, but I hadn't realized it. I thought I was running from the infection, but I was already too late. I felt it then, the change, a subtle shift inside me, like something crawling under my skin, taking hold. My breath came ragged, my legs weak. The figure stood still, watching me, waiting. And then I understood. I wasn't escaping. I was already one of them.